5,000 years ago, long before Rome and Greece were even a blip on the radar, one civilization was already doing the absolute impossible. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're digging into something truly fascinating. You know those ancient Egyptian megastructures, right? The pyramids, the massive temples, the colossal statues? Well, they weren't just engineering marvels. They were actually highly calculated political tools. From the very start, pharaohs used this extreme architecture to project their power, keep control of their people, and legitimize an absolute, unshakable divine authority. They were literally building their resumes in stone to prove they were actual gods on Earth. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're not just looking at a list of topics, we are mapping out an empire's monumental egos, tracing their sheer megalomania from mud brick dams all the way to mountains of solid stone over a span of 3,000 years. We'll hit engineering the first gods, Sniffer's quest for perfection, fortresses and propaganda, Akhenaten's rebel city, and wrap up with the ultimate monumental egos.
So, starting us off with Section 1, Engineering the First Gods, Menes and Djoser.
This story starts right at the baseline of Egyptian power. Think about it. To be a god on Earth, you kind of have to do godlike things, like controlling nature itself. Around 3000 BC, a warrior king named Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt, but his biggest flex was establishing the capital city of Memphis. The Nile River flooded catastrophically every single year, so Menes' engineers stepped in and constructed this massive 49-foot stone and rubble barrier. We're talking about the first dam ever built in recorded history. By literally redirecting the mighty Nile to protect his city, Menes physically enforced his will over Mother Nature. It was his way of proving his divine right to rule. Let's move to and see how this builds with Pharaoh Djoser around 2667 BC. He wanted a tomb that would last for all eternity, and he turned to his brilliant architect, Imhotep. And Imhotep did something completely unprecedented. He abandoned the traditional mud brick structures they'd always used and just flat out invented large-scale stone architecture. By pulling that off, he literally elevated the pharaoh to a god in the eyes of his people. If we walk through this timeline, you can visually map out the brutal trial and error process of pyramid building. It wasn't just an overnight success, you know? We start with those flat mud brick mastabas, then Imhotep stacks them up to create Djoser's massive 20-story step pyramid. But look at the rapid, staggering architectural evolution over just a few generations. We get a collapsed pyramid at Medum, an awkwardly adjusted bent pyramid, until finally they hit the perfected, true red pyramid. It was an incredibly steep learning curve, paid for in blood, sweat, and thousands of tons of rock. Which brings us to Section 2. Sniffer's quest for perfection, featuring a guy who was basically a PR genius. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast. Snuffer was the pharaoh who finally achieved that smooth-sided true pyramid shape. But his obsession tells us exactly how power worked in ancient Egypt. It was brilliant public relations masking a very harsh reality. On one hand, Sneffer used his accessible personal name. He'd address common peasants as friend or brother, and he cultivated this really benevolent image. But behind the scenes, to fund his absolute obsession with building 3 massive pyramids until he got the math right, he ruthlessly emptied the state coffers. He looted neighboring Nubia, Libya, and the Sinai Peninsula, which earned him the terrifying title, Smiter of Barbarians. So his architecture required immense brutality, but he masked it with brilliant PR. Let's shift gears to Section 3, Fortresses and Propaganda, Sesostris III versus Hatshepsut. As we move into the Middle and New Kingdoms, leadership styles wildly diverge. Some pharaohs went straight for brutal intimidation. Just listen to this chilling quote from the pharaoh Sesostris III. "He who protects my boundary here, he is my son. But as for him who does not protect my boundary, he is not my son." I mean, wow, this guy operated like a ruthless Roman general. His statues literally show an arrogant, brooding ruler who relied entirely on fear and military might to maintain his borders, especially down in the gold-rich region of Nubia. And Sesostris absolutely backed up those terrifying words with brutalist military architecture. He built a sprawling network of impenetrable superfortresses along the southern frontier. Places like the fortress of Buhen were massive. We're talking multiple layers of defense, moats, and emplacements for archers that could fire in any direction. It was cutting-edge military engineering designed purely to project terror and absolute control. But that raises a massive question. What happens when you completely lack that traditional military machismo? How do you project absolute power when tradition says you shouldn't even be ruling at all? This was the exact problem faced by Hatshepsut, the most powerful female pharaoh in Egyptian history. While a traditional warrior king relied on plunder, brutal forts, and fear, Hatshepsut completely flipped the script. Since she couldn't rely on being a warlord, she used brilliant, elegant architecture as pure propaganda. She commissioned a breathtaking terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Inside, she covered the walls with reliefs showing the supreme god Amun-Ra directly participating in her conception. She even had her statues carved with traditional male physical contours and a strap-on beard. It was this massive, coordinated architectural and artistic campaign to legitimize her reign. Part of that propaganda also involved boldly advertising her direct link to her divine father, Amun-Ra, using obelisks. But have you ever actually wondered how they raised a single solid piece of granite weighing 1,100 tons without modern cranes? Well, the genius is literally in the sand. Engineers would build a mud brick enclosure around the base, fill it completely with sand, drag the obelisk up a ramp so it rested horizontally on top of the sand, and then gradually dig that sand out from underneath. Gravity slowly and perfectly lowered the massive obelisk right onto its base. Just an incredibly elegant solution for an incredibly elegant pharaoh. Moving on to Section 4, Akhenaten's Rebel City, the Heretic's Utopia. So the crucial point is that if Hatshepsut was elegant, our next pharaoh, Akhenaten, was a pure egomaniacal heretic whose impatience permanently changed engineering. He wanted to abandon the established capital and build a brand new city dedicated to a single sun god, Aten, and he wanted it built yesterday. This demand led to the invention of the talatat. These were small, standardized limestone blocks, basically the ancient precursor to prefabricated building materials. Instead of hauling massive stones, a single worker could carry a talatat block, which allowed his new city to spring up with unprecedented speed. And the scale of this project was just staggering. Akhenaten uprooted the entire power structure, completely abandoning Thebes for a virgin desert site. Honestly, it would be like suddenly moving Washington, D.C. out to an empty patch of Texas. He built a 24-square-mile city called Amarna and designed it so the roads radiated outward from his own tomb like the rays of the sun. He literally required all his subjects to constantly bow and scrape in his presence. But here's the catch. His absolute obsession with his own divine city meant he completely ignored foreign affairs. As a result, the empire's borders began to shrink and crumble. His megalomania quite literally blinded him to the real world. Which brings us to the climax in Section 5, the ultimate monumental egos, Seti I and Ramesses II. Following all the chaos of Akhenaten, the empire desperately needed stability. Enter Seti I. He was a military man who brought hardcore military efficiency to his building projects. When it came to engineering his eternal home in the Valley of the Kings, he basically created an assembly line of death. He organized these incredibly efficient teams of stonemasons, plasterers, sketchers, and sculptors. They worked using oil lamps with meticulously measured wicks so overseers knew exactly how long they had been working. The result? The deepest, most fantastic, and fully decorated tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings, complete with hidden staircases and false chambers to fool robbers. But Seti's son took ego to a level that hasn't been matched before or since. Welcome to the era of Ramesses the Great. Talk about extreme stats. Just look at these. He reigned for an astonishing 67 years. He fought a massive, bloody stalemate against the Hittites and somehow spun it into legendary PR. He married at least 17 wives and fathered well over 100 children. Ramesses was absolutely determined to prove his virility, power, and godhood at every possible opportunity. And honestly, nothing represents that better than the number 69. That is the staggering height, in feet, of the 4 colossal statues of Ramesses sitting outside his great temple at Abu Simbel. Carved straight out of the face of a virgin cliff, this wasn't just a building. It was a monumental sculpture demonstrating that art, engineering, and a massive ego could literally reshape a mountain. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate goal of all Egyptian architecture. Deep inside Abu Simbel, over 200 feet into the mountain, Ramesses is sculpted sitting right alongside the 3 supreme gods of Egypt. He is positioned as their absolute equal. The temple reliefs even show Ramesses the pharaoh presenting offerings to Ramesses the god. He used the labor of thousands and the genius of the ancient world's best engineers to achieve literal self-deification. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to close on.
We've seen these pharaohs manipulate rivers, invent stone architecture, and carve their actual faces into mountains, all to bridge the gap between mortal men and the eternal gods. But if even these breathtaking mountains of stone were eventually buried by the desert sand and lost to history, what does that say about mankind's eternal struggle to engineer a bridge to the divine? It's a wild testament to human ambition, the psychology of absolute power, and a legacy that still totally captivates us 5,000 years later. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.